Well, it is such a joy to be with you, and I share that same sentiment. Getting to know Steph over the last few months, again, just felt like, did we go to school together? Do we know each other? Do we go back some ways? And I just have felt such a kinship to this church and the community and what you're trying to do here all throughout the Minneapolis region. And it's just really, really special. I said this to Steph right before the first service. You know, for 18 years, I had the joy of serving as a senior pastor in a couple of different churches and being a part of the local church in that way until jumping in to do what I do now with World Vision. And as such, now I have the opportunity to be a part of lots of different churches in these sorts of capacities, right? Weekend to weekend to weekend. And occasionally, you just meet a community of people that just feel so special. And you guys feel that way to me. It just feels like God is doing something really remarkable in your midst. And I just got to say, and I think you know this, do you know you have one of the best pastors ever? I mean, really, quite honestly, you do. I do. I mean that genuinely. I mean, Steph's leadership and her husband, the whole team is doing together here is just really, really remarkable. And we love getting a chance to be a part of it. I just wish that my family could have the chance to be here with me this weekend. I've got a picture. This is kind of like a close second. I know it's not the same thing, but a close second. This is my wife, Pilar, my son, Andrew, there in the back. He's a senior in high school this year, and my daughter, Abigail, in front, who just started her freshman year at Kent University in Ohio. And, this photo was taken a couple of years ago when we visited Crater Lake National Park. If you've never been to Crater Lake, you got to add that to that list of places that you're going to travel to. It is absolutely breathtaking. And every time that I see this photo and I see that blue water, that deep blue turquoise, it reminds me so often of the children that we serve and the communities who lack access to that basic necessity. And young girls, you know this, many of you do, largely girls, who will walk on average 6 kilometers, that's nearly 4 miles, 2 times every day, to gather water that is so filthy we wouldn't even use it to wash our own cars. Water that is filled with bacteria that is the leading cause of death in the developing world. Nearly 50% of all children under the age of 5 will die in the developing world from water-borne diseases. And what's wild to me is that those diseases are largely preventable. The water crisis is a solvable problem in our world, and World Vision has made it our mission to solve that problem in our lifetime. And so, before we jump into the message today, I just want to pause to say thank you. Thank you to those of you, especially those of you who recently, just a couple of months ago, ran, crawled, if you need to the finish of the Twin Cities Marathon or the 10-miler. You know your impact, but I need to share it with the whole church today. You know, you've been partnering with World Vision since 2016. And over that time, if you can believe this, over that time together, you have raised nearly $250,000 for clean water. Clean water for 4,500 children. 4,500 children. I need you to just think about that number for a moment. That is 84 school buses of children. 84 school buses of children who have dropped jerry cans and picked up textbooks and are now experiencing fullness of life. And all because you said yes. And I'm so excited today because Steph and the team and I believe that God is not done yet. That God would continue to inspire this faithful community of believers all around Minneapolis here to unleash a movement of generosity and compassion that will change the world. To do something together that begins to answer the question, how do I make my life count? You know, when my kids were younger, they loved a good arcade. Any kids in the room love a good arcade? I'll tell you what, when the winter was heavy, we would load our kids up and take them into these arcades, these hundreds of games. You know this place, flashing, blinking, quarter-wasting games. And sure enough, when my daughter Abigail, who you met a moment ago, was 10 years old, I filled her pockets to the brim with tokens, and she went through an arcade, depositing here, putting a token in and playing over there. But after a bit, I began to notice that she'd slowed down. Abby wasn't playing nearly as many games. She started walking around aimlessly. Seemed like 5 minutes or so had passed, and No more games, no extra tickets won, no more tokens deposited. And I asked her, Ab, what gives? And she turned to me and she held up one single final token. And she said, I've only got one left, Daddy. I got to make it count. She made her way over to this big game, this big wheel. Think the big wheel in the final showcase of the final countdown or whatever it is on The Price is Right. You know that wheel? And she put in the token. I tried to talk her out of it. I said, nobody ever gets more than about 10 tickets on a game like this. But she was resolute. She put the token in, and with all of her 10-year-old might, she pulled on that wheel, and round and round and round it spun until finally it landed on the jackpot. 1,000 tickets. I snapped this photo, 10 years old, big toothy grin, snapped that photo that day, and she turned to me and she said, did I make it count? Did I make it count, Daddy? And it just makes me think, don't we all want to make it count? Don't we all want to make our lives count for something beautiful, something meaningful in this world? And that's a question I just want us to consider together this morning. You know, there is a very surprising description of you that is used in the New Testament, the second half of the Bible. And there's a term that's used there of you that very likely when I say it here in a moment, you will not naturally gravitate towards this term. Now, there are other words that you would identify with that describe who you are, words like redeemed, accepted, forgiven, loved. But there is this other word, this word that when I say it, I highly doubt you're going to think, oh, yeah, that describes who I am. You want to know what that word is? That word is this: priest. Anybody connected to the Catholic tradition, maybe raised in the Catholic Church? My wife, Pilar, and I met at the very first church where I served in Nashua, New Hampshire. I was an associate pastor at the time, and she came, like many of you, to sort of exploring her faith for the very first time, but we became fast friends and hit it off over time, and after some time passed, I sort of wanted to ask her out, and she sort of hoped that I would, but having been raised in the Catholic Church, she had one very complicated question. Can you date the priest? Now, I was not a priest, of course, but when that's what you're raised in, when that's what you understand, it's a really honest question to ask. So on our very first date, just for kicks, I showed up at her front door, I knocked there, and I was wearing a clerical collar and a long black robe. No, I didn't do that. But in many ways, it's true. You and me, if you're a follower of Jesus, this is a term that is used to describe you. Listen to this scripture. Peter, who was one of his disciples, one of the very first leaders in the very first church, who wrote to some of the very first Christians, he had this to say about you. Peter said, from the Message translation, you are one chosen by God, chosen for the high calling of priestly work, chosen to be God's instruments, to do his work, to speak out for him, to tell others of the night and day difference, how he has made you from nothing into something, from rejected into accepted. You have been called for the high calling of priestly work. Now, we're going to describe that more, but I'm going to change mics here real quick, okay? All right, how's that? Better? All right, now we're on, okay. You have been called for the high calling of priestly work. And I know you didn't come to church today thinking, hey, I'm going to enter the priesthood. And neither did those very first followers of Jesus, that audience that Peter was writing to. See, this was a very big shift for the early church. See, up until this time, the work of what we might call ministry was largely reserved for a few people who felt a special call from God and served in a specific place in the temple. And as such, it was the priest's responsibility, largely alone, to do two things. First, it was the priest who would reconcile people back to God. It was the priest then who would stand between God and other people and do whatever needed to be done, make whatever sacrifice needed to be made so that that person could be in right standing with their Creator. And the second thing the priest would do is that they would then minister to the poor. They were the ones who labored to restore the broken circumstances of their community. As a result, the priestly work was sort of like the A-team kind of work.
and everybody else was sort of the B team player. But here's the deal. When Jesus went to the cross, his sacrifice reset that system. And a revolution started that is still playing out today, still playing out in this community, your community here today. A revolution that made a way for anyone who would put their trust in Jesus alone, that they could stand before God now once and for all, forgiven and free. And that established God's presence no longer in a physical temple on the Temple Mount, but rather now in you and me. Scripture says that you are the temple of the Holy Spirit, that you are the place where the power of God dwells. And as a result, that's why God has given you gifts, spiritual gifts. Peter continued on. 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter says to that audience, he says, God has given you gifts, each one of you, from a great variety of spiritual gifts. Manage them well. There it is. Make it count. Why? So that God's generosity can flow through you. It makes me think of Edgar Sandoval, president and CEO of World Vision these days. Let me just paint the picture for you for a moment. Here's someone, Edgar, who had discovered early in his life that he had a gift, likely a spiritual gift of leadership and aptitude for strategic thinking, a commitment to team building. And he would immigrate to the United States, and he would attend Rutgers University, and his abilities sharpened there, and then eventually got an MBA from Wharton School of Business and expanded on his experiences even more. And Fortune 500 companies like Procter & Gamble began to take notice, and eventually he found himself leading from the C-suite. But even corporate executives wonder, how do I really make my life count? And one day the phone rang from an executive headhunter and reminded Edgar of his roots, how as a boy he had survived his own broken circumstances, immigrating to the United States with only $5 to his name in pursuit of his own fullness of life. And a new challenge was issued. Would ministry just be for a select few people in very certain places who feel a special call from God? People like pastors who teach scriptures and stand on stages and lead churches, or would ministry be for anyone, everyone who would place their trust in Jesus? And so Edgar traded the boardroom for the barrio and has led World Vision to becoming the largest Christian humanitarian organization in the world, a team of world-class colleagues who bring clean water to a child every 10 seconds, who respond to the largest humanitarian disasters around the world, who distribute more food aid than any other organization, who will annually train 500,000 pastors to be the hope of Jesus in their own communities. But it took Edgar believing in his gut that there is no A team and no B team in God's economy. Just one team with one mission to, in a word, do whatever it takes, no matter the cost, to reconcile people back to God and restore broken circumstances in this world. Church, that is our mission. That is your mission too. But there is this hurdle that we all face. There is this desire for that is stirred within. Certainly we can be inspired by the words around it all, but there is this real barrier to actually living this out. See, there is a quiet whisper that echoes in all of our hearts. And the whisper is this: who? Me? Who, me? I mean, how could someone like me with limitations like mine make an impact in this world? You ever hear that whisper before? I always find it interesting whenever we stand before a big vision. I don't know why this is. It's just part of human nature, I guess, that whenever we stand before a big vision, there's just something inside of us that always thinks about our limitations, our scarcity, what we don't have, what we don't bring, far more than we think about what we do have, what we do bring. That certainly was the case for a man named Moses. I know you've been wondering, is he going to get on to Genesis or Exodus here at some point? Well, here we are in Exodus. You've likely heard of Moses. Moses was one of the central figures in the Old Testament. The Old Testament's the first half of the Bible. And his story is captured in a book of the Bible that we call Exodus. Moses was a leader who directed the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and was to lead them to the promised land, a region that is roughly around the region of Jerusalem today. It was Moses who would climb Mount Sinai and hear a word from God and bring back 10 commandments to guide the people of Israel. He was the one who was chased by the Philistine army, stood at the banks of the Red Sea wondering, how on earth am I ever going to get all these people across into safety? And yet in that moment when his staff was placed into the waters, they parted so that people could walk across on dry ground. It was Moses who has such a strength of leadership and impact that his words are still studied and celebrated thousands of years later. And yet Moses wrestled with that same quiet whisper. How could someone like me with limitations like mine make an impact in this world? See, this great and mighty leader began to wonder how his life could make a difference. And he was not that mighty leader when he first asked the question. When he first asked the question, he was a simple shepherd out on the open range, a rough and tumble man's man who slept in the open field with a dirt-stained Carhartt and a sweat-stained Stetson. See, this was a man who had been met by God at the burning bush with a grander vision for his life. He was to leave his sheep and walk into Pharaoh's Egyptian court and challenge the greatest power of his day to be merciful and compassionate and generous to the poor and oppressed and marginalized of his world. And does Moses respond with courage and grandeur and strength and bold leadership? No. No, Moses listens to that quiet whisper. First, to the whispers of self-doubt. Exodus chapter 3 and 4 is where we learn this story. You'll see in Exodus chapter 3, verse 11, Moses begins to protest to God. He says, God, who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people out of Israel into Egypt? That whisper of self-doubt is there. God, do you really think that I have what it takes? But God assures Moses he is not reliant on his abilities alone. Rather, God reminds him, Moses, I will be with you. And then there is that whisper of the skeptics. You ever hear skeptics' whispers in your life? Moses protests again. He says, but what if they don't believe me? What if they don't listen to me? What if they say, Lord, I've never appeared to you? And God reminds Moses that significance isn't found in the approval of others, the applause of the crowd. Finally, Moses listens to the whisper of his own personal shortcomings. Exodus chapter 4 says, but oh Lord, I'm not very good with words. I never have been. I'm not even now. Even though you've spoken to me, I get tongue-tied. My words get all tangled. You notice how many pronouns are listed there? How many times Moses uses the word I or me in that quick little exchange? Remember that old country song? I want to talk about me. I want to talk about I want to talk about number one, oh my, me, my. Remember that one? And again, we're reminded that making an impact is never about us. It's about what God can do. I think really the point of Exodus chapter 4 is God demonstrating his power, his authority to work through a single person to change the world. God reminds Moses that if it's something that he's calling him to, he will also resource him with every resource that he needs to make his impact. Paraphrasing from verse 11, God says to Moses, I'm going to give you the words. Don't you worry, Moses. I'll provide you with a partner in ministry, a pastor named Aaron who will bring a certain eloquence to your message. Finally, Moses just can't quite take it any longer. And there is this whisper that suddenly becomes a shout. Exodus chapter 4, Moses pleads again, Lord, please, just send somebody else. You ever get to that point? Maybe because of the whisper of self-doubt or the noise of the skeptics or your own personal shortcomings where you just sort of reach a point where there's no longer any fancy words to offer. You just sort of throw up your hands and say, oh, please, God, pick somebody else. If so, you're in good company. Because right in the middle of this exchange, Moses begins to wrestle with a profound question. See, God draws Moses back to what I think is the center of our discipleship. trust. God asked Moses, Moses, what's in your hand? What's in your hand? Now, when you think of a shepherd, what do you see immediately? You know what it is. You see it immediately in your mind's eye, right? You see a staff in his hand. A staff, he replied. Shepherds were notorious for hanging on to their staff for as long as possible. Moses had probably carried this staff for years. Some, in fact, believe that this staff had been passed down through the generations. And as a result, it represented some very powerful things in Moses' life. This thing that he held in his hand, it captured his identity, a sense of who he was as a shepherd. It demonstrated his influence and his authority. That staff is what he would use to poke and prod and move the sheep wherever he needed them to go. That staff was his pathway to affluence. Certainly was the way that he made his income. And God says to Moses, listen, I want you to take this thing that's in your hand, and I want you to throw it down. Take what little thing you think you have, what little thing you think that you bring, your identity, your influence, your affluence, and release your grip that you have around it and throw it down and watch, Moses, what I will do. And so Moses does. And in that moment, his staff instantly becomes a snake. Something that was once just a dead stick of wood, an inanimate object in his hand, now suddenly is wild, alive, unpredictable. And then God says, now Moses, I want you to look down. I want you to grab that snake and pick it back up. And Moses does. He grabs that snake by the tail, and instantly it becomes a staff in his hand again. Again, I think God demonstrating, what we're to learn from this is God demonstrated his power, his authority, to use what little things that we have, what little thing that we think that we bring, and allow him to do immeasurably more than we could ever ask, ever imagine, that God might change the world. So here's what I want us to consider this morning. You have been called by God. Called by God to be his people and do priestly work in this world. To reconcile people back to Jesus and to restore their broken circumstances. And as such, God has given you some gifts. He's placed some things in your hand. He's given you an identity, some affluence, some influence, so that the generosity of God might flow through you into this world. And when you fully surrender to that, when you loosen your grip on it and offer it fully to God, he will use it to change the world. What you're holding in your hand may seem simple and insignificant. A staff was just a dead stick of wood in Moses' hand, but when released to God's purposes in this world, it became wild, alive, unpredictable. David had just a sling and a few stones to defeat the mighty Philistine army. The unnamed boy on the mountainside with Jesus had just 5 loaves and a couple fish. Peter had his testimony and the courage to speak. Edgar Sandoval had an MBA and a deeply personal understanding of what it meant to be one of the marginalized in this world. We all have something in our hands. How will you use what God has placed in yours that his generosity might flow through you? Especially for children in this world, vulnerable children like Michelle. I'll conclude with this story. This is Michelle. She lives in Bartabwa, Kenya. And until just a few years ago, Bartabwa had no source of clean drinking water. Instead, Michelle and young girls just like her would walk this rough terrain, about a mile in her case, 2 times every day, so that she could fill a 5-gallon jerry can with water from this small pond. This is the pond that's actually in Bartabwa. This is the pond where Michelle and her family would gather their water. It's where they would wash what few clothes that they had. As you can see in the back of the picture, it's also where livestock gather around the perimeter of that pond to drink and to relieve themselves. And for years, this pond was the leading cause of death in Michelle's village. And when I first learned of the challenges that were facing Bartabwa, you better believe it wrecked me. But what wrecked me even more was in knowing her. A 14-year-old little girl with just as much inherent dignity as my son or my daughter. And so that's when our family decided that we would partner with Michelle and her village by becoming Michelle's sponsor. And it costs us $39 a month. And it's the best $39 that we spend all month long. And like so many of you, we pool it together with other folks who are also passionate about bringing transformation into that community. And do you know the impact of sponsorship is far greater, far more long-lasting than anything we could ever imagine for ourselves. You want to know what the impact of sponsorship is in Bartabua? It's this. This is the water kiosk that now sits at the center of the Bartabua community. And these are the women who are raising strong and healthy children. These are the champions of young girls who now excel in school. These are the mothers whose courage and testimony is transforming far more than just their own families. It's transforming ours. See, friends, in the next few moments, Pastor Steph and the team here and I would just like to invite you to drop in your token and spin the wheel and make your life count for something beautiful and wonderful in this world. To say yes to being chosen. See, about a year ago, you all made a big, bold decision that you would help World Vision flip the script on child sponsorship. Many of you may know, for years and years and years, the way we would do child sponsorship is we would come and bring pictures of kids and hang them on string lines in your lobby, and you would have the opportunity to look into the faces of those kids and choose who you wanted to sponsor. But because of the courage and inspiration and innovative spirit of this church, you helped us flip that script a year ago. Where no longer would we show up with those photos, but rather we would invite you to take your picture. And we would send it into El Salvador for a choosing party on a Wednesday, and your pictures would hang there on the line. And kids would be able to walk in and have the dignity of choosing you. And a year ago, on September the 3rd, 174 of you from Mill City said yes and decided to use $39 a month and pool it together with everybody else to bring restoration into a specific community called Canaan. And you know, the impact there has been mighty. And today, we want to invite you to do it again. See, Pastor Steph and the team here sense God calling you to build on that impact in that region. And so in a moment, we're going to invite you to say yes. To again, send an epic photo for some of you who have never done it before, to do it for the first time. For others, to consider if God would call you to bring impact to an additional child in that community. So that on this Wednesday, there could be a choosing party where kids have the dignity of showing up to choose you. Watch this video, and then Steph's going to come.